Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you to our panelists for joining us and for our audience online and in person. Our event today is titled Moscow's Weaponization of Food, Holodomor and Blockage of Grain Exports Today. And this event is co-hosted with the McCain Institute. So I've got some of Ukraine's top experts and advocates for Ukraine's victory in its fight against Russian aggression here with me, and that includes the weaponization of food and hunger. It's also my pleasure to introduce my co-host, Dr. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. So we have two of our Ukrainian experts here today who are part of the leadership team at the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. We have Elena Halushka, also a board member at the fantastic Anti-Corruption Action Center, and Hanna Hopko, a former member of Ukraine's parliament and head of the Democracy in Action Conference and founder and chair of the board of ANTS, National Interest Advocacy Network. So we're speaking about food supply and agriculture in Ukraine today, so I'm also happy to say that we will hear directly from an entrepreneur in Ukraine's agricultural sector. I'm going to turn to Dr. Hopko for a brief presentation on the key issues and then the video from Ukraine. Then we'll have a moderated discussion and turn to audience questions. For our online audience, you can visit askac.org and I can pitch your questions to our panel. Again, that is askac.org. And for our in-person audience, we've got a microphone for you to step up to. Now, Hanna, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's my honor today to be in Washington, D.C. and to have this presentation, especially in the eve of 90th anniversary of commemoration of the victims of Holodomor genocide. And our discussion is Russian weaponization of hunger from Holodomor to present day. I think it's really important to just remind the audience that nothing changed from Moscow, then Soviet Union, and now Russian Federation, because their imperialistic nature of their statehood is the same. So they, as Peter the First, I wouldn't say the Great, rename Moscow still in the name of Rus. And then during the Soviet time, especially when we're talking about Holodomor as genocide, and Moscow's purpose today remain the same, to destroy our nation, except that it expanded, and through weaponization of hunger, they want to, how global South countries and nations there starve from hunger. So let me start from the first slide. From the 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was an attempt of illegal annexation of Crimea and de facto occupation to the full-scale war, it's so important for us to talk about freedom of navigation and freedom of export. And because if you analyze what's happening, so Russia systematically exports stolen Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea and the Bosphorus, and since February 2022, volunteers of Bosphorus observers using open data has identified about 180 Russian ships exporting Ukrainian grains through the Black Sea. So actually, volunteer tracked ships from the ports of occupied Crimea to the ports of Iran. And also, according to the US Congress report, in order to export the stolen Ukrainian grain, Russia used cargo vessels that could sail along with the coast of Turkey, Syria, Israel, Iran. So actually, Russia, by stolen Ukrainian grain, receiving extra money to produce more weapons, to keep killing Ukrainians by constantly organizing massive ballistic, cruise missile, kamikaze drones attacks. So this is also this time what's happening with the militarization of the Black Sea. And if we look back to the Holodomor genocide time, also the leadership of Soviet Union has deprived Ukrainians of food to break into submission the Ukrainian nation by starving and killing millions of Ukrainians. And one of the documents, the archives suggested that through Odessa port alone, it was planned to load an overall 570,000 tons of grain for export in 1932. Also, overall, the OSSR grain export in 1932 amounted to 1,007,000 tons, and in 1933 to 1,600,000 tons. So actually, the same. Russia stolen during Holodomor, and now. So. And actually, the Soviet Union needed the currency to import from the Western countries, in particular machinery, technologies, equipment, which were crucial for Soviet industrialization plan. And now what we also see is that Russia using money to get Western components to produce more modern weapons. At what we analyzed, and several think tanks in Ukraine, like NACO, Transparency International, that 90% of Western components are going from the United States, Switzerland, Germany, and other nations. So it's really important not to allow Russia to do this. And when we talk about Russian war of aggression, from ongoing aggression for almost 10 years. So we should definitely mention that Russian aggression or the impact on the agriculture industry. So Russia occupies over 18% of Ukrainian territory. 18. Since the beginning of the full-scale Russian war, Ukraine has lost over 19% of its planted areas in 2022. So also after ecocide or destruction of Kakhovka electro power plant, almost 70% of Kherson region was left without water for irrigation. 5,000 hectares of arable land were unused because of ongoing war. And most notable losses have occurred in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv region. So also we should mention about ecocide, and I do believe that Ukraine, through international tribunal and also through compensation mechanism, we will demand, because now, according to General Prosecutor Office, around 57 billions of US dollars, it's a total amount of damage for environment destruction and ecocide. So let's move to the end, and attacks on port and grain storage facilities. So you've seen from when Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Security Grain Initiative, they immediately started to destroy our terminals, Mykolaiv, Odessa, and Russia is using in Ukraine explosive devices, shells, and landmines prohibited by international community, and also attacked Danube ports and blocking alternative grain export routes. And I think it's really important to remind you about the strategic role of Ukraine as a top 5 food producer. And actually, it's important also to understand that before the full-scale war, we sell more than to 100 countries our agriculture. After the blockade, of course, situation is different, and we have to remember that we are selling our agriculture food products to countries in Africa, Asia, and the Black Sea Grain Initiative I mentioned. And what is important to understand, that Russia or Soviet during Holodomor as the genocide. So, and now, so Russia is also committing genocide against Ukrainian people, and I'm very thankful to those nations who already recognize Russian aggression, war against humanity, ecocide as also part of genocide. And I prepared a special slide on genocide, and according to the Professor Lemkin, what it's mean, and all classification, like killing members of the group, causing serious mental harm to members of the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, what's happening also in Ukraine. And I think the key is here to mention that after General Zaluzhny article second analysis published recently. So it's not about stalemate, about positional war. It's a wake-up call to our American friends, it's a wake-up call to our European and to all world leaders that the faster Ukraine receive everything it needed, not this incremental approach with sanctions policy, because sanctions are being imposed, they never achieve the effect to collapse Russian economy or to limit Russian capacity to produce more weapons and stop massively attacking daily our infrastructure and killing people. And also, it's also important to learn the lessons from Holodomor genocide, which is very important because at that time, Washington not only failed to act, actually at that time even rewarded Kremlin with diplomatic recognition of Soviet Union. It happened on November 16, 1933, which is, I think, really when League of Nations wasn't properly responding on the Stalin genocide against Ukraine. And I think now, and as a consequences of Holodomor genocide, Ukrainian nation and Moscow was allowed to bury our nation for generations. And it took us a lot only in 1991 to restore our statehood and to regain independence. And actually, but Russia became an existential threat and real threat for the West. And also Holodomor genocide provoked Hitler and also then other issues. So I think now it's a time, and we are here in Washington, D.C., to explain why victory of Ukraine is strategically, geopolitically important for the whole world, and no compromises at the expense of justice or some pressure for Ukraine to concede its territorial integrity. So I think it's important not to allow Russians to instrumentalize hunger to blackmail the West to lift sanctions or to weaken sanctions, because we understand all these traps. So the key is here, never again genocides against sovereign independent nations should happen. So this is why the lessons from Holodomor genocides, when we expected to receive from League of Nations, from Washington, D.C., more and real support. So now it's a time to, how to say, we are here to plant seeds of truth. So it's important for next year, 2024, to help Ukrainian farmers to plant seeds and feed the world. But this discussion today, and I'm so thankful to the Atlantic Council to organizing this, because I think seeds of truth matters, that never again Holodomor or genocide through weaponization of food happens against Ukraine or other sovereign independent nations.
Thank you so much, Hanna. That was really powerful and has a lot of lessons and wake-up calls. And as you mentioned, the farmers in Ukraine are experiencing this, and also as people around the world are hungry because of Russia's aggression, I'd like to now turn to a video to hear directly from someone in Ukraine's agricultural sector.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak at the conference on behalf of myself and Ukrainian farmers who heroically work in the fields despite Russian aggression. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Leonov Sergey, co-owner of the young company Rovey and Tech Agro, which has been working in the agriculture business since 2018. The company Rovey and Tech Agro grows agriculture products, corn, sunflower, wheat, soybeans, berries, sea buckthorn, blackberry, raspberry, and watermelons and melons in the Kyiv region. The land bank is 1,500 hectares. The company had their own modern fleet of agriculture machinery, grain stores, and planned future growth. But everything changed on 24th February 2022. 2 months Russian occupation destroyed almost everything that company had done for 5 years. Company's lands were under the occupation of invaders. The Russian invaders destroyed all our available agricultural machinery. The harvester was destroyed from the inside by grenade. Tractors and seed drills were used to cross the river. Some of tractors were burned. All property, tools, weather station was stolen. In addition, the invaders destroyed the agriculture products that were in the grain stores and flour stock and almost the entire harvest and potential of all winter crops. Thanks to the armed force of Ukraine, the occupiers were expelled from our lands in April 2022. The first question a farmer faces after land occupation is how to take the first step to his fields. After all, the fields are mined, a large number of shells that did not explode, and this is a very big problem. About 400,070 hectares of arable land have been mined in Ukraine. Land in demining takes about 10 years, and this is in a country located in Europe. Despite all the difficulties, destroyed equipment and machinery, demining of fields, we successfully carried out the sowing campaign in 2022 and 2023. The pack of aggregation, machinery and grain store were partly restored. But especially in 2023, the company realized that growing crops is only 30% of success. The main question is, what should we do with the grown agriculture products? Now, every farmer in Ukraine is faced with this problem due to Russian aggression, which uses the issue of export of agriculture product from Ukraine as blackmail, undermining the food security of the world. Our main problems are destroyed logistics routes. The cost of logistics is 50 to 100% of finished product cost. Termination of the grain corridor. Continuous bombing and destruction of port infrastructure of sea and river ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv regions. Shelling of civilian vessels entering to the ports of Odessa region. Limited export of agricultural products to European Union countries due to strike of the local farmers and transporters in European Union countries that share common borders with Ukraine. Lack of sufficient quantity of grain stores for agriculture products instead of instant sale directly from the fields. All this led to the fact that the purchase prices of agriculture products in Ukraine are lower than European prices by 50% or more. The cost of the grown products is lower than purchase prices. And if the problems with the export of agriculture products are not solved, the grain corridor does not work, then most farmers will reduce the number of sown areas by 2024. That is, in Ukraine, the number of sown areas in 2024 may be 50% less than the sown areas in 2021. Our company does not give up and continue to work for victory and look for new ways to develop. Ukrainian farmers have always worked and will continue to work on their native land. In the end, I would like to express my thanks to all organizations and governments of countries that provide assistance to farmers and the Ukrainian people. Together, we will defeat Russian aggression. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you for bringing us that video. I'm so glad we could have that perspective. Now we're going to turn to our panelists. Evelyn, I'll turn to you. So you served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia leading up to and during Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. As we heard from Hannah, there are historical parallels to the Holodomor with what we see today in Ukraine. Now, looking at the current war, is Russia's weaponization of the global food supply a new tactic of aggression during its full-scale invasion, or have they utilized similar policies since 2014?
I think, first of all, thank you so much, Shelby, for inviting me to co-host and for moderating this. And thank you so much to Hannah, to our Ukrainian colleagues for coming here and testifying in person to what is happening to your country and what Russia's doing. There isn't that much attention being paid to the economic impact and, frankly, the global economic impact of what Russia has done, again, not just to Ukraine, but frankly to people living in Africa and the Middle East, people who are in extreme circumstances. They were already in dire food scarcity circumstances in places like Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan. But the impact of Russia's blockade has, of course, made things even more dire. And I would include it made it difficult for places like Egypt, which is in the headlines for other reasons. So what I would say, Shelby, is that the Russian approach has changed over time. So, of course, it was always hostile and aggressive, and Russia had an imperial perspective with regard to Ukraine, that Ukraine belonged to Moscow, if you will. And so in the initial onslaught and in the initial attempt to gain control over Ukraine, Russia thought that it would convince some kind of government in Kyiv to bend to its will. So President Poroshenko at the time was the president, and the Russian approach was to annex Crimea, but then also to start the war in Donbass. Now, of course, that had an immediate economic impact because Donbass was the agricultural seat, but also a place where great industry is located and has been historically, was part of the Soviet Union, et cetera, and is still active right now. So the Russian government made an attempt to cause pressure, to wreak havoc politically on Ukraine, and the idea was to get the Ukrainian government to capitulate. So it wasn't yet quite as aggressive as what we see today. The reason, I believe, that Vladimir Putin invaded in the full frontal invasion in the way that he did, that his government did over a year ago in 2022, was because the initial approach wasn't working, that the government wasn't buckling, and in fact, you had a new president who was standing up to Russia. He was going to fight corruption, and the West had come to Ukraine's aid militarily and economically. So the pressure tactic wasn't working. And Putin was also, of course, we think, misled by his intelligence and military experts to think that he could conduct an invasion that would involve taking over Kyiv. Then he thought all of this would belong to Russia. It didn't work out exactly as he had planned, but now he has a much more aggressive and, frankly, obvious approach towards to Ukraine, to Ukrainian people, to the economic impact of the economy of Ukraine, to the grain supply, et cetera. The impact, actually, I have to say, goes beyond what you mentioned. You use the word blockade. It goes beyond the blockade because the McCain Institute, we have something called the Ukraine Business Alliance. We were just in Ukraine, I think about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. I don't know, time flies so fast now, post-pandemic. But we met with Ukrainian officials, and over again, we heard, number one concern, of course, air defense, but number two, mines. And the mines have not only affected, of course, the war and civilian infrastructure and the civilians in their homes, but also agriculture. And part of the reason why you can't sow in the fields is not just because of lack of fertilizer, perhaps, or because of the fact that the Russians are putting the farmers under direct pressure. But even when the Russians leave, they leave these mines in place. And the mining is beyond anything that we've seen in recent past. The rate that it would, the amount of time that you would require to demine Ukraine now is astronomical. And so technologically, we need to come up with new solutions. So I think the approach has shifted. The other aspect of it is, while initially Russia came in and decimated, basically took the Ukrainian Navy, what was already not a very modern Navy. We had been working in the United States trying to help the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian Marine Corps and Navy were a little more interested in learning from us than the land forces, but nevertheless, it wasn't a huge Western-oriented force anyway. But when Russia came in, it took the assets, seized about $10 million, by the way, of U.S. equipment that we had given Ukraine. They still owe it to us. And in addition to that, or to Ukraine, because we had given it to Ukraine. In addition to that, of course, they then, over time, restricted freedom of navigation. And that then ultimately became a blockade, which Ukraine has only been able to reverse using technology and the bravery of its, fighting forces to essentially push Russia back. But Crimea also became heavily militarized, another way to squeeze off access. The Danube ports are also being constantly shelled by the Russian forces. So I can go on and on, but what I would say is that the strategy has evolved, the methodology has evolved, the Russians are very aggressive, and you know, there's much we can talk about what to do about it, because the other aspect is the rest of the world, that this has had an impact far beyond Europe, as I mentioned, to Africa and the Middle East. Cindy McCain, of course, late Senator McCain's widow, Ambassador McCain is running the World Food Program, and you know, before she was in the front of the TV cameras more recently with regard to Gaza, she was always advocating for breaking that blockade. And I think the international community, frankly, needs to do more on this front. We need to restore international access to the Black Sea, and that's not just for trade, but you know, across the board.
Thank you very much. Dr. Halushka, turning to you now. So what would you say to those who suggest that the West should lift sanctions on Russia to get Moscow back in the Black Sea Grain Initiative? And is this a realistic proposal?
Well, I think that giving up to the blackmail, it is the strategy which leads to much more blackmail in the future. And here we should make the right conclusion, and this is that sanctions work, that their impact is felt in Moscow. They haven't yet brought the implications which we would want them to do. But, you know, the wrong conclusion would be to lift sanctions. The right would be to toughen them. And if you take a look what Russians are actually asking for, they want to their agriculture bank to be taken out of the sanctions. They want some additional supplies for the equipment, farming equipment spare parts. And they want insurance for ships and something like that. So I would rather, you know, ask ourselves why we are still stuck with having just 10 or something like that banks that are actually sanctioned. Why not all of the 330, something like that, banks are actually sanctioned, because that leaves the loophole, you know, to transfer the payments through other banks as well. And I think that we have to realize that the best grain deal is Ukraine being armed to teeth and able to provide the security for the navigation in the Black Sea. And that's something which Ms. Farkas already said, that there is this Ukraine corridor, which is working right now. And just today there was the news that 100th ship left Odessa. And we have to understand that Ukrainian defense forces managed to achieve this result. And this is indeed a striking result with very limited resources. So I would say that, you know, instead of thinking how to lift sanctions and bring Russia into the grain deal, which is just a tool of Russian pressure over the Western world, over us, over African countries and Asian countries, the rest of the world, we have to think how to provide Ukraine with all of the necessary military capacities and capabilities to be able to ensure the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. And that's the only way to make sure that we have sustainable grain deal, and not a grain deal which is the tool for the blackmail and abused at any possible moment. And I would definitely want to also stress on the fact that we need to protect our infrastructure, because Russians are using the missiles, these Onyx missiles that our air defenses cannot effectively intercept against the coastal towns, Odessa and Odessa region. The issue of demining, including in the Black Sea, not only in the on the land, but in the sea, is as well a very big issue. So we think that the faster Ukraine wins this war, the better it would be for everybody, both from the economic, political, but also from the justice perspective.
great. Thank you for highlighting all of that. Back to you, Dr. Hopko. This has been touched upon by your presentation and our other panelists, but as you highlighted, Moscow's weaponization of food insecurity has global consequences that are far-reaching beyond Ukraine's immediate neighborhood. So what concrete steps can Ukraine's allies take to combat this weaponization of food?
So it's very important questions, and if to be honest, so of course we need bravery of our Western partners. Because, for example, in the South China Sea, there is freedom of navigation operations for NOP. Why? We don't see such operations in the Black Sea. And before the full-scale war, all NATO ships, and before we had several Navy exercises in the Black Sea area, but all disappeared. So actually, Western nations allowed Russia first to blockade the Black Sea, and this is why political will and bravery is crucially important. Also, your Congress adapted the Black Sea Security Act. It's important that President Biden signed it, and actually this will be extra measures and more support in this area. And also, I think when we are talking about the consequences, so reduction of grain cargoes to the countries of Asia, Africa by almost 3 million tons per month, 3 million tons. And Russia destroyed after withdrawal from the Black Sea grain initiative, reduction of Ukraine's export potentially by 40%, and they destroyed 300,000 tons of grain. So 300,000 tons of grain. We can imagine how many people, millions of people, could receive food. And recently, our colleagues returned from Cambodia and Vietnam, and they mentioned the hike of price for rice. So it's all interconnected. So why people are suffering and facing hunger or because of these weaponizations of food. And but the key is here, what I wanted to explain, that it's already 10 years of ongoing Russian aggression, 10 years. So, and it's strange that countries representing almost 2/3 of the world economy, including the largest military alliance in history that includes 3 nuclear powers, has failed to prevent Russian full-scale war and actually genocide. So this is the success of the West would have been happened if we prevent the genocide. And now during the 20 months of new genocide within 1 century against Ukraine, we still discussing about escalation and ATACMS. We need more ATACMS. We need German Taurus. So actually, it's great to hear good words about Ukrainian armed forces, how they are creative, how they sank Moscow a year ago, how they destroyed Russian Navy in Sevastopol, how just this weekend also we managed to destroy another 2 Russian military ships. But I remember last year when General Zaluzhny published his first analysis, asking for 300 tanks, asking for weapons. So actually, I do believe if Ukraine were receiving everything needed before, so the Crimea would be deoccupied this year. So actually, my request, my pray to leadership of Western nations, time matters. I returned from India. I visited New Delhi before G20. And we met with Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Energy of India, and all of them were mentioning 3 global crises: fuel, food, fertilizers. But no one was ready to mention the real problem. Who caused these 3 global crises? And when I asked why Ukraine is not invited to G20, Because G20 is about economic growth. We are not UN, we are not talking about security, peace and stability and others. But I think the US credibility is at stake also. The longer war lasts, the countries in Global South, this is what I learned in India, they are observing how Western support is helping to win. So this is why I think now we need, and here we are also to express our gratitude to American people, also to express gratitude for bipartisan support we've received, with also a message from General Zaluzhny, our military. A lot of our friends are in the battlefield. So we know situation from our friends, what's happening. So this is why in the war of attrition, it's Russian scenario. We cannot compete with Russia, who is much bigger and has more resources in manpower, military, equipped with ammunition from North Korea, Iran, and others. So this is why I truly believe that the West is more powerful, much powerful, and you have more leverages to help Ukraine to defeat and de-imperialize Russia, because it's not about, like with the Soviet Union disintegration in 1991, this became the end of communism ideology, but not the end of Russian imperialism. So our idea, and we produced the Sustainable Peace Manifesto, where we declare the key principles, how to reach sustainable peace. Sustainable peace without punishment of the aggressor, through tribunal, through confiscation of Russian assets and reparations. Is not impossible. And also, it's some people, some experts telling, we have to think about stability. But stability at the expense of justice will bring all of us to the World War III. Let's be frank.
Thank you for that. Dr. Farkas, much of the power of this Kremlin tactic of war relies on the globalized nature of the food supply chain. From a defense perspective, how serious of a security risk is this, and how might the US and allies mitigate the security dangers that Moscow's blockage of Ukrainian food exports poses now and in the future? And are there lessons from the Kremlin's weaponization of food and hunger that apply globally, as Hannah was saying?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say that, I agree with so much that Olena and Hannah have already said. First of all, we have a situation where we have never been, in my lifetime, this close to World War III as we are today, because of the alignment of forces, because of what Russia has unleashed, because Russia is working with Iran and with North Korea, because now we have this horrendous war in Gaza, which was unleashed by a barbaric attack, unprovoked attack on the Israeli people. All of this, it has the potential to spin even more out of control. And the forces that we see and experience today will only be magnified by climate change. And again, you talked about ecocide, but there's also the actual ecocide that we as a global community have been, frankly, conducting. I mean, what we have been doing to our planet will also, we will see, unfortunately, exacerbate everything. So I think it's important to understand that there are multiple forces working, at play here. The reality is that, as Olena said, the most important thing that we can do today is to provide the assistance that General Zaluzhny, that the Ukrainian government has requested, provided as fast as possible, all of it. Because yes, in a war of attrition, Russia can win because Russia has more manpower and Russia doesn't care about the cost of human lives. Yeah. And so Russia can wait and wait, and that's Putin. Putin all along has been waiting, because also the West gets tired. You see here in Washington, D.C., where we're sitting today, this debate about assistance to Ukraine. It's actually ridiculous because it's about 3 to 5% of the U.S. defense budget being spent on Ukraine in order to, so far, eliminate 50% of Russia's military capability. And guess what? What is the largest threat being posed to NATO forces? And frankly, one of the largest threats being posed to the United States today, Russia. So thank you very much, Ukraine, for severely, weakening one of our number one adversaries, number one or two, depending on how you slice it. I would argue, frankly, that Russia is the greater danger to the United States and the international community than China. I think we can work with China. China is not yet saying that they're going to eliminate, break down the international order. But what Russia is doing right now brings us closer to sphere of influences and what we had pre-World War II and could lead us to World War II. And of course, we know, if you study your history, the backdrop to that is also very much economic and protectionism, which has also been unleashed, separately, not necessarily all related to Russia's attack on Ukraine. So I think it's very important, first and foremost, that we provide as much military assistance as fast as possible. Ukraine needs help with air defense, with countermine. Technology has to be the key to reasserting control. Frankly, Crimea, I know my former colleague, General Ben Hodges, talks all the time about if you can take Crimea, you can defeat Russia, you can kick them out, because it is like a large aircraft carrier sitting there just off the coast, if you will, of Ukraine, even though it's part of Ukraine. So I would argue that there is more that we can do if we are thinking more creatively. There are fears. I do remember them. I was old enough to remember when the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, I was living in Europe at the time, working with Soviet scientists. So it was very interesting to watch them all go out to the courtyard outside because they thought everything was bugged, to discuss amongst themselves. But the reality was that, yes, there was some fragmentation of the former Soviet Union, and there will be fragmentation of the Russian Federation if Vladimir Putin and his foreign policy is defeated. But that's not something we should fear. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have conflict. Of course, it increases the risk of some conflict. I find it hard to imagine that Chechnya will quietly leave the Russian Federation. But on the other hand, there are plenty of Russians who, I have to consider them more expert on their country than I am, who argue that actually a new Russian government that is more fair, that is more aligned with democratic principles, could make a deal with some of these constituent parts of the Federation, and that maybe there won't be a collapse. Either way, it's not actually for the West to decide. If we believe in our values, if we believe that people have individual rights, that peoples have the right to demand their sovereignty and to try to achieve it according to the UN principles, then we must stand by those values. So I also agree wholeheartedly with what you said, Hannah, when you were making the point about values. Values are important, and as the head of the McCain Institute, I have to say that because Senator McCain he never said what's practical, what's practicable, what's doable. He always said what's the right thing to do, and we should pursue the right thing because in the end, that will align with our interests, and that's the case here.
Thank you so much. So carrying along with the topic of values and also interests, Dr. Hulushka, I'll turn to you. As we've also discussed, Russia's disruption of grain shipments has contributed to higher global grain prices, which you saw firsthand, Hannah. They've had a disproportionately negative impact on food access in the global south. Despite this, many political leaders in spaces where these impacts are most felt have aligned themselves with Moscow. Why do you think these leaders might be motivated to demonstrate their support for Moscow in spite of suffering there? How might they change, and what outreach is Ukraine doing on this?
Well, thanks for this question. It's indeed a very big paradox for us. We think that there is a number of reasons for that, and first and foremost is that Russia is utilizing the links that USSR has built with global regions. And, for years, for decades, they were playing on this decolonization argument and allegedly helping them, to get out of the influence of the West as they were portraying it. Also, there has been years, of the so-called security assistance, but provision of the weapons. And we also know that Wagner Group has been used in some of the African countries. And in some of those countries, they were actually seen and perceived as the security guarantors, not as the terrorists as they are actually. In addition, there has been very strong propaganda, pro-Russian propaganda, which is portraying all those implications that you mentioned, not as the consequence of the Russian aggression, but on the contrary, as the consequence of Western sanctions. So if the sanctions are lifted, then everything will be as great as usual. How this can be corrected, fixed? Well, obviously that requires a lot of the work to be done by Ukraine, by the Ukrainian government, and there needs to be policies of much more sustainable cooperation. But we as the civil society can also do our part of the job. We actually started it already. We've conducted, in cooperation with the President's envoy on the Crimean issues and a number of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, a big forum a month ago under the title Crimea Global: Understanding Ukraine Through the South. And we brought 35 experts, opinion leaders, journalists from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we had a very frank conversation with them about the Russian aggression and the global implications, about the nuclear security and safety, and the very dangerous precedent of the Russian nuclear terrorism, which actually goes completely unpunished. The sanctions against Rosatom are not even imposed, I mean, strong sanctions against Rosatom, not just on the several public officials of the company. But also we spoke about the food security, about decolonization and the imperialization, about horrendous human rights crimes, and particularly crimes against kids, deportations, and how those kids are being returned to Ukraine, etc., etc. And there was a very good presentation from the professor from one of the South African think tanks, Greg Mills, and he basically analyzed the public perception in the African countries of the war and Ukraine, and compared that to the official stance of the leadership. And he basically made a few very interesting revelations for me personally. And there is again, very interesting specific correlation is that the highest level of support for the democracy as the most preferred way of governance of the state is in Africa, because it is deprived basically of democracy. Most of the countries are under the authoritarian rule. And in South Africa, he said that 74.3% of people condemned invasion, Russian invasion. Similar numbers are in Tanzania, and even in Zimbabwe, which is largely under the Russian influence, 58% of people still support Ukraine, while their governments are either neutral or leaning towards Russia. That means that people understand very well. People very often do not share the stance of their leaders. And I think that we as the civil society should continue working with these freedom-loving people that are across the entire world and continue explaining to them what is the reason why we are fighting, that putting down weapons would not bring peace, but putting down weapons would bring occupation, as our Nobel Peace Prize winner Alexandra Matviichuk always repeats, and it would end up with Ukrainians going through much more horrendous crimes, but the world just won't know about them because they won't make it to the media. So this is absolutely not the solution. Only the victory is solution. And when you start explaining to them, explaining the heroism of Ukrainian farmers, who, as the farmer on the video explained very well, that when Russians were kicked out of the Kyiv region and they came on their fields, everything was destroyed, everything was mined, and they basically not had to start from scratch. You know, their starting point was much worse than simply starting from scratch. And when you convey the stories like that, human stories, you know, that what farmers have to go through, what families whose kids were kidnapped and they had to spend, you know, months to figure out their whereabouts and then return them back. So I think that such personal stories help us to convey the message about this war and mobilize these regions which we are not historically very closely working with. And people-to-people contact is the answer.
Excellent, thank you, and for reminding us of the important role of Ukrainian civil society, which is well represented here. So I'm going to do one more question, and then we'll turn to audience Q&A. We've got some good questions coming in, but you can still submit more questions at askac.org. For our in-person audience, we've got a microphone right over there that you can step up to. Dr. Farkas, I've got a big question for you, and to take it briefly. Turkey plays an important role in securing trade from the Black Sea to the rest of the world. What role has Turkey played since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in ensuring Ukraine's capacity to export to global markets?
Yeah, I mean, you're telling me to take it briefly. That's very difficult. Turkey does play a big role. Turkey has been, by and large, constructive when it comes to the trade and the transit. Turkey, first of all, they control access to the Black Sea. So in the beginning of this major phase of the war, the last year or so, they stopped NATO and any other ships from going into the Black Sea. I think that's important to understand when we talk about freedom of navigation, because we do want freedom of navigation for commercial and military vessels in the Black Sea area. But Turkey determined that given the war, that they would block any warships from going in, except the warships of the countries around the Black Sea. So one part of the answer to all of this is, of course, to make sure that we work to also help our NATO allies and partners like Republic of Georgia who are on the Black Sea, to help them make sure that they have sufficient maritime capability to deter Russia from what Russia is doing. Because essentially Russia is trying to make the Black Sea a Russian sea and to choke off access. So I think that's one important perspective. When this is over, Turkey can help, and we must help through NATO ensure that there is freedom of navigation for military and commercial vessels. We need to build up, I think Hannah mentioned the Black Sea Initiative. There are number of Black Sea initiatives. There's legislation pending in the US Senate to provide assistance and to build up a diplomatic effort focused on the Black Sea area. This is a very important part of the world. It links Europe with the Middle East, and Turkey has an important role to play. Turkey has its own interest at heart here. Turkey understands that it needs to conduct some transactions with Russia, but at the end of the day, Turkey relies on NATO. Turkey is a NATO ally, and I think we can work and should work with Turkey more aggressively to get Turkey to play an even more constructive role.
You made it brief. Thank you. We'll now turn to audience Q&A, and I'll also ask our panelists to continue with that brevity. We'll turn to our in-person audience. Please introduce yourself and ask a brief question.
Thank you very much. My name is Mykola Mirsky. I'm the Advocacy Director at ROSM. And if the moderator will indulge me, I have 3 very brief questions.
One.
One, okay. So my one question is for Dr. Halushka. So you mentioned sanctions. I think that sanctions might be a way for us to answer the General Zaluzhny's call to find a new way for us to get past the defenses, get past the trenches, right? So there's technological innovation that he called for. Do you think that the sanctions have been effective to date? And in what ways would you like to see the sanctions beefed up? Thank you.
Thank you.
Will we collect or one by one?
One by one.
One by one, you can take
Okay.
that.
First and foremost is that, we cannot expect the sanctions to be 100% effective in stopping the aggression like Russian, because we know that Iran has been under sanctions, for decades, but somehow it managed to build its military capacity and avoid and circumvent sanctions. So that is the argument which we are very often hearing, when we are pushing for more sanctions, that it's not the job of sanctions to stop the war. It is just the job to make it much more expensive for Russia. Is this the maximum achievable? Obviously, no. Because if you take a look at, for example, technology sanctions, which from my perspective are super important. I mean, we are asking every day, how come that Western-made chips continue ending up in Iranian drones, in Russian missiles, which are raining on the heads of Ukrainian civilians, and that would intensify over the winter because autumn was relatively calm, meaning that they were accumulating those air targets, and they would be sending them at us. So how come that we are seeing that there are a few cases of the convictions for the entrepreneurs who were delivering those, supplying those technologies, but that's absolutely not enough. It shouldn't be an exemption, it should be the rule. And there should be much more persecutions of those who evade sanctions. Then price cap. I mean, there are a lot of the reports of the investigative journalists that, how they are avoiding trading below the price cap, and, there is entire, ship fleet which is non-registered, which helps, to facilitate this trade. This is absolutely crazy, but that's also about that sanctions exist, but what about their enforcement, and what about sanctions for the evasion of the sanctions? So that's something which should definitely be toughened. And I'm still very much convinced that one of the most powerful sanctions would be actually to confiscate Russian money, to confiscate Russian central bank's assets. That would help to resolve the issue of the lack of money for Ukraine, because the West currently sits, G7 and European countries are currently sitting at the $300 billion worth of Russian central bank's assets, which were frozen in the first days after the beginning of the full-scale war, and they were never actually used for Ukraine's self-defense, for our recovery, for the compensation of damages, including for the compensation of damages for Ukrainian farmers. Because in the first year of the full-scale war, the documented damages for Ukrainian agriculture sector was equal to $40 billion. That's a lot. But those people, they are receiving the support of the state, of course, but to the large extent, they have to be seeking for the credits, for the loans, for the assistance programs from the international donors. But why not make Russia pay? And that's something, we hear a lot of legal arguments, economic arguments. We've, came up recently with a paper where we collected a lot of the findings of many prominent scholars, including here American scholars like Larry Summers, Mr. Zelikov, Philip Zelikov, and many others. But we also argue with the figures that there is no alternative to Western reserve currencies. And this is the myths that in case if the confiscation is done, then the reserves of third countries will flock into somewhere else. And there is no answer where they could flock, because figures show that yuan is not the alternative, gold is not the alternative, rupee, etc., etc. So it's very important to make sure that sanctions are toughened to the maximum possible level and supplemented by the proper military assistance, which is aimed at ensuring Ukrainian victory and not ensuring Ukrainian survival, could be a very good combination.
And if I may to add, because it's important, so why Wagner Group is not recognized as a terrorist organization? Why Russia is not a state sponsor of terrorists? Why European Parliament adopted this important resolution and now using this resolution as a legal basis for future confiscation of assets? So this is also important to understand that Russia is a terrorist state. You cannot negotiate with terrorists, you have to punish them. So these half measures, because we were expecting hellish sanctions as a punishment after the full-scale war. Now it's almost second year of the full-scale war. We are, every month we hear like good news, extra 10 Russian banks are now under sanctions. In half a year, our ambassador here posting on Facebook saying that, oh, great decision of US State Department, another 30 banks are under sanctions. So in this incremental approach, when Russia is adjusting to sanction policy. Banking system is also shifting from bank which are under sanctions to another. Why during the Russian withdrawal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, one of the demand how they tried to use the UN was to lift sanctions from Rossельhozbank, chaired by Patrushev's son, because this is the bank not just for money moving, also it's buying technologies and others. But the question is, this half measures, this incremental approach, this is not something when the key is here, the strategy towards Russian Federation, and don't be afraid of Russian being defeated in Ukraine. So actually, we have to be prepared for, not for key and chicken speech second or third on others. We have to be ready for real strategy working as McCain Institute. And I met with Senator McCain several times. So really, I think it's like Reagan-style policy. The enemy will be defeated, we will win. And it should be implemented in real actions. And if we stand, what do we stand for? For values, for dignity, for freedom. This is why we have not to be scared of what Russia will do. Actually, because we understand that even in nuclear blackmail of Russia, it's a part of the blackmail. So the West is much stronger. So you have to believe that you stronger, that Russia with the economy less than New York or other.
Texas. Less than Italy or something.
Thank you very much. We have more questions, which means we need to do more discussions on this. But for now, we're going to end here today. Thank you to the McCain Institute for co-hosting with us. Thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine. And thank you to everyone for joining us in person and online. And stay tuned for future events. You can find us online at the Atlantic Council's website and McCain Institute's. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you for moderation and preparation.